Heyo, as much as I really like dark media, I'm not really a fan of dark themes for shock value. For me, darkness in storytelling should have a purpose, like if it helps people process difficult emotions, says something about human nature, or makes people aware of uncomfortable realities. If the dark content exists just to be edgy or provocative, it just feels exploitive than anything meaningful. An example would be like various romance webtoons constantly depicting sexual assault as a tool, either to usually make the protag and the love interest closer through trauma bonding, or to show that some character or spirit is bad. Why does webtoon have so much rape in it? Oh my god. I think the reason it shows up so much, especially in media aimed towards women and girls, is because of how frequent it actually happens in real life to women and girls. Bad things happen to people, so fiction becomes a space where they can rewrite the narrative. For some, they fantasize of being saved from a moment of helplessness by something or someone better, stronger, and kinder that could protect you. For others, they fantasize of saving someone else from a moment of helplessness by being something or someone better, stronger, and kinder that could protect someone else from an experience that harmed them personally. Both of these are very normal human desires after something so traumatic, and I don't think there's anything wrong with using fiction to privately work through those feelings, but the context changes when that coping mechanism becomes public. That's where my personal problem stems from. I know that there are victims who absolutely can't handle the mention of sexualization at all, but some like reading stories where the assault survivor is taken seriously, given justice, or allowed to heal in some way they never got to. So I imagine when sexual assault is continuously used as a trope, a shock factor, or even a romanticized gimmick to make the main character and love interest fall for each other, people feel like they have to get pissed at the fact that essay in media exists at all. It seemed like people got really confused when I said that one way to ethically consume weird fiction is that you know how to keep the fictional scenario and real life separate. Because isn't all fiction separate from reality? Physically, yes, because a fictional story can't force anyone's hand into harming anyone, but psychologically, I am led to believe that it's a lot more complicated. A lot of people consume content that they'd consider to be unethical in real life purely based on if it actually reminds them of a real life parallel. There's a reason why people were less weirded out with Jacob imprinting on a literal baby in Twilight, and are more weirded out with the teacher getting with an underage student romance tropes that appeared in media that Twilight was a part of, despite both being forms of large age gaps and potential grooming. One is a very unrealistic fantasy with werewolf magic soulmate imprinting, so it's a lot harder to relate it back to reality, while the other is a very real abusive power dynamic that happens in real life all the time, which makes it more triggering and ethically fraught. The trope is so common that creators who've actually been groomed by their teachers and want to share their story get called out for romanticizing that dynamic because people conflate personal catharsis or trauma exploitation with endorsement. I'm sure that people were still bothered by Jacob and Nessie's dynamic when they stopped to think about it, or because others just hate any portrayals of what could be unethical dynamics in romance media, no matter how bizarre, but there's still a difference between the context of both concepts and their psychological plausibility. When a story has abusive or predatory elements that could be comparable to real life, it invokes experiences that real life survivors live through, even if the story's foundation is based on the fascination with a fictional concept. Of course, there are also creators out there who do take what they address seriously, but because of however many creators discuss the topic with insensitivity a lot of the time, people are very quick to assume that any way a sensitive topic is being brought up is insensitive. There was some press about Jeanette McCurdy announcing her new book, Half His Age, and some people were very upset because they assumed that this book was going to be an erotica due to the description being that the story follows a 17-year-old navigating an affair with her married teacher. As someone who's seen her writing material before with her previous book, I'm Glad My Mom Died, I can 99.9 guarantee that this is not going to be an erotica. Jeanette has always been blunt about how she views major age gaps as exploitive. She's talked about how when she was younger, she rationalized those relationships as flattering or as a sign of maturity. With hindsight, she can clearly see the predatory dynamics. When reflecting back, she's very clear that these weren't real relationships built on equality, but situations where an older person had power and she was just too young to consent in a meaningful way. So when it came out that she was writing about a 17-year-old girl getting with her teacher, I didn't see that as Jeanette being interested in dark smut. I saw it as someone who lived through grooming dynamics and wants to address them as honestly as they can. The title alone, Half His Age, already frames the relationship to be wrong, but because of how often people see taboo age gap as just a part of spicy, forbidden erotica, people just gave her backlash without even seeing what the material was about. It can get a little frustrating with books because a lot of book critics don't actually read the actual material. They judge a book by by the title and cover and assume problematic aspects about the book based on stereotypes and associations, man, that sucks. I wish somebody would make a quote about judging in books or something, I don't know. I think it just becomes ironic when I hear various critiques on certain pieces of media, and you can always tell if the critique is based on assumptions or the actual context of whatever they're critiquing. I've been seeing this comic I read a couple months ago, Tears on a Withered Flower, popping up in a couple of videos on my Explore, mostly about the main woman. To be honest, I've read a lot of the uncensored version of this comic. Like, I think I've read 50 chapters of it already, and I do not like this comic. Not for any real problematic reasons or anything, I just think it's a bit too corny for what it is, and it had me sighing and doing that dog basking in the sun face, but I understand why others like it. The main problem that other people have with it though is purely because the main character is a 30-year-old thin Asian woman who doesn't look 30 and she has big breasts. As someone who already does not like this series, that is not a valid reason to hate on this series. I've been seeing so many fixing this character and all they do is make her breasts smaller, and that annoys me a lot more than it probably should because I typically don't care about what size a woman's breasts are. All breasts are equally awesome, from flat to gigantic to male, but the people I see that make posts about this story complain that her body isn't realistic. But that argument doesn't hold up to me because nothing else about this story is realistic. I believe this story takes place in Korea, and I'm not familiar with the social culture, but this walking doormat gets cheated on continuously by her cartoonishly terrible no-good husband and takes longer than the time that it would have been satisfying to finally leave him, gets over him immediately, and manages to accrue the desperate attention of a young man who happens to be a 6'7", nonchalant young Korean billionaire who canonically looks like a famous celebrity that every guy in universe is jealous of. I'm not sure if that's common for Korean daily lives, but not only is the story cliche and unrealistic from an American viewpoint at least, but everyone in this comic also looks unrealistically beautiful as well. The entire comic is a delusional fantasy that would very rarely happen in real life, which is also why I'm not put off by all the stalking in the story either, because of how disconnected the rest of it is from reality. I don't understand the people who edit her body to be more realistic just makes her flatter. If they wanted to make her body more realistic, they could have given her more body fat and not just in the waist, because women with naturally larger breasts typically have bigger arms or broader shoulders so that their body could realistically support larger assets. Smaller breasts don't equal less sexual, and it also doesn't change the fact that this comic is also an erotica, so it's going to sexualize every character because that's the point. Even when these creators also edit the main love interest to make this very realistic storyline match the realism of the characters, all they really do is edit their height gap, so they make him a little bit shorter and her a little bit taller. But if his height is unrealistic, wouldn't his muscles, clear face, giant hands, flat stomach, insane V-taper, and light green eyes also be unrealistic for the average Korean man? Like, if we're going to nitpick, I can point out more things to be upset about, because I know for a fact that these people haven't read the actual story due to the fact that they don't like what the characters look like. It's fine if you don't want to consume something, but it's just unreasonable to attribute the reasons why you think this entire series is bad is something that's arguably unimportant. Another shallow critique that I find within a lot of controversial pieces of media is that a lot of judgments will stem from how the fandom interacts with the media instead of the media by itself. There were some people asking me to talk about the game The Coffin of Andy and Lele because there's an incestual couple in the game, and I'm very much a hater, to say the least, of certain relationship dynamics within fiction. But within the context of this game, the incest part pales in comparison with everything else in the game. I've heard that this entire game has implications of sexual and romantic tension between the two characters, but I don't know if I resonate with that interpretation because siblings make dirty jokes and rely on each other sometimes. A lot of the endings have very obvious implied incest, but honestly, even if the game didn't have any implications of incest at all, I think I would still hate this game, considering that it's just so lazy in the actual horror aspect. All of the horrific actions, from the comparably small bad actions of interpersonal manipulation, verbal abuse, parental neglect, blackmail, and misogyny, to the comparably bigger bad actions of cannibalism, murder, worshipping demons, incest, stalking, physical abuse, and parental abuse, are done purely out of shock value. And everyone else in the game is horrible too, so there's no actual pinpoint of what the horror is. It's not really horror if everything that's committed within the story is treated to be completely normal and justified. The game seems like it tries to make the siblings seem more human with complex traits instead of just making them cartoonishly evil, as if they're trying to do an unreliable narrator thing, but it kind of just makes it seem like they're trying to make you feel bad for them because they're a product of their environment. But I think that was just bad writing, not because the company is trying to excuse anything that happens. The game's characters are toxic beyond reason, where none of the horrific things that they would do would be excusable in real life already within the game's context. So I'm confused why the line gets drawn at the seemingly tame incest aspect, especially when one of the incest incest endings is the sister raping the brother while he's blackout drunk. And again, it handles it as purely shock value because being a horrible person that doesn't respect her brother is just a part of Lele's character. I can excuse, but I draw the line at incest. Like, what the f? The main problem comes from fans who glorify the game because they've chalked the entire game up to be that incest horror game, because they're only fans for the incest implied endings. But that problem kind of pales in comparison to the other problem that comes from the haters who demonize the game because they've also chalked up the entire game to be that incest horror game, ignoring that maybe horrific things are supposed to happen in horror. Obviously, you don't have to like the game because I think it was bad for reasons that I don't think was supposed to be bad. But the fact that people chalk it up to just the incest aspect tells me that not only have they not played the game, they also didn't even look into it at all. The same problem happened with Killing Stalking because Killing Stalking is also a story that features horrific things happening to the people within the story, but because a character has romantic feelings for another character, people have labeled it as a romance, even though it was and still is a psychological horror. I've said before that many creators need to handle taboo content more responsibly so people don't mistake their material for being something that it's not. But in these cases, I think the creator did their job. Even if the smaller aspects could still be critiqued and disliked, the creators still labeled them as horror and rated them properly like they were supposed to, because these are horrific stories, meaning that audiences should know that these stories are going to horrify them. I've heard that people have speculated that the original creator of that coffin game had an incest fetish, but I think the only reason that people thought that was because she didn't take any of the criticism against the incest seriously, but other than that, I can't find any proof of that whatsoever. Based on the information that's been presented to me, I'm just going to conclude that she made this game for the right creative reasons and not for the other incestual fetish reasons, even if the execution of it was just so bad, in my opinion. Sometimes creators do really well in depicting certain things in a non-offensive way, such as depicting the devastating thing with a lot of sensitivity that it comforts the victim, making their work so satirical or unrealistic that it's obviously a bit, labeling their work in the correct genre, or even putting enough content warning to deter those who can't handle such things. So by themselves, the piece of horrific fiction alone will be good, but then the creator would be outed for doing similar horrific things that could be tied back to their own work. I think one of the more frustrating parts of being a dark media fan is having to explain how depiction does not always equal glorification. I saw this video talking about the book Lolita, which tells the story of grooming from the lens of a pedophile, but one of the comments viewed the book in a very negative light and suggested that the author must also be a pedophile if he could write such things. Someone replied to them and used the depiction does not always equal glorification point, but they used Stephen King as an example of someone who writes about horrific things, including ones that are done to young children, but just because he writes about those things does not make him a bad person who does horrible things to children. I would say that this specific example of Stephen King is probably a bit more harder to make now because of the sarcastic tweet that he made a few months back saying that the Epstein list isn't real. After he tweeted that, he doubled down by mocking those who believe that there were others involved in Epstein's trafficking ring by saying that the list is like UFOs because everyone knows at least somebody who's seen one. He stated that he believed that Epstein did traffic a little girl because but that he doesn't believe that there's a client list and that it's just conspiracy fodder. I think Stephen King is a registered Democrat and has disagreed with Trump and his choices a couple times, but a lot of people found it very suspicious that the one time that he sides with Trump on something, and it happens to be about trafficking children, because of how bad this looks for Stephen King, especially since he refuses to explain himself and just doubles down on his statements instead. A lot of people are using his art as more signs to point out the fact that he either might not take CSA as seriously as it should be, or that he outright sexually assaulted them before. Then it becomes a case of separating the art from the artist because Stephen King is still very good at horror. So much so that he makes horrific jokes that make him seem like a horrific person. But it just gets very hard from the audience's point of view to separate his fictional depictions from glorification in his books when he, as the creator himself, could have possibly blurred those boundaries in his private life. Art is often seen as the extension of the creator. In most cases with horror artists, realistically, dark art is usually an extension of the creator's abstract thoughts and expression, not a direct reflection of what the artist would endorse. Junji Ito would be a good example of a very wholesome figure in his real life, but the reason why he creates such good horror is because he gets scared easily, not that he secretly does all the things that he imagines. Most horror artists function like this, where they get fascinated with the idea of fear and or that it's just another form of thrill seeking. But in the case of Stephen King, where he behaves in ways that could possibly echo, minimize, or muddy the themes he explores in fiction, their art could be very easily interpreted to be an extension of him in a literal sense, instead of an abstract way, especially if he refuses refuses to clarify his thoughts in a reasonable way, then I don't blame the audience for also using his weird depictions of children and sexual context as a reason to be suspicious. It's very tiring to hear people constantly complain about dark art for being dark because dark content can be good. It just depends on what the context it's being presented in. Dark media is already such a vague phrase that exists as an umbrella term for things like Disney killing off moms to fucking Shadman, that we have to define the specifics of what context makes consuming and enjoying things like Cinderella, which depicts child abuse, perfectly fine, and what context makes consuming fictional children being very concerning. In both contexts that I bring up where creators don't portray bad things as bad things, and when audiences don't recognize corny or horrific bad media as purposefully bad, it stems from the same issue of people refusing to engage with the media on its own terms. Instead of trying to see what the piece of media is trying to do or see how it's framed, many people just assume that if it exists by itself, then it's enough to degrade those who either made it or those who enjoy it. That doesn't mean that every single critique is invalid, because obviously I have my own nitpicks too, but I want more criticism to be logical and make sense without the sole reasoning being that it bothers me. Some dark stories want to disturb you, some want to warn you, some want to explore taboo desires in a safe and fictional space, and some just want to shock for the sake of shock, and sometimes that's okay. But I don't know, that's just me. Laters.